Hi everybody, it's Liz here. Just talking to you this evening about energy availability in athletes, REDS, which I will describe in more detail, and aging athletes and bone density. As most of you know, I'm the sports dietitian here in training. I'm also a marathon runner, a qualified chef, and a coach for the beginners route at Cleveland, down at Cleveland Point there on a Monday night. Anyway, so let's start the presentation. So first of all, I just wanted to flag, which some of you hopefully will have seen, because you'll be getting the emails as coaches from Athletics Australia, that earlier this week they sent out the latest coach education news, so check your inbox. There's some really interesting information on there that you can all access. There's the consensus statement on athlete nutrition, and there's been a release of a comprehensive guide to sports nutrition. So it allows you to have the latest information for yourself or your athletes on fueling their training and performance. So the consensus statement is a useful starting point if perhaps you just want a bit of a summary, but there's a whole set of open access documents available to you as well, which is really interesting reading. So I just wanted to flag that if you hadn't seen it. Okay, so energy availability. What exactly is it? Well, it's the difference in energy intake and exercise energy expenditure in relation to fat-free mass, so in relation to your muscle mass. And obviously we require a certain amount of energy every day just for physiological function, but there are also different classifications of energy availability. So there's obviously something as called high energy availability, and that might be perhaps if someone's looking at some healthy weight gain, or perhaps they have high energy needs and they're looking at just weight maintenance. There's also optimal energy availability, so that can be for weight maintenance, but providing adequate energy for all those physiological functions that the body needs to do. It might also be optimal energy availability for somebody who's going through a period of injury and rehab, so they might not be training as much, but it's just, making sure that they have adequate for their rehab and training and for the level of activity they're doing, but looking at not gaining weight or losing weight. Then you have subclinical low energy availability, which may be tolerated for short periods, perhaps if someone's on a well-constructed weight loss program. So it's specifically done to lose weight, but in a structured way. And then you have clinical low energy availability. And that's when you start to have those health implications and impairment of those physiological functions, which can also affect your training, adaptation, and your performance. Now, measuring the energy availability is actually quite difficult. There's different ways of looking at, we'll talk about a bit later, but yes, there are maybe some things that happen that perhaps can be assessed by blood tests, having a doctor, or perhaps having a bone density scan. So low energy availability obviously leads to a negative energy balance. And that, of course, leads to some weight loss as your fat stores are used up, and also potentially muscle mass, because there's not enough dietary energy coming in, so the body has to start using what it has for fuel. And we know that long-term low energy availability does cause metabolic and physiological adaptations to reduce total energy expenditure. So basically the body's on a go slow. It's slowing everything down because it really wants to use the energy that it actually has to try and keep all those vital physiological processes going, so that the body actually obtains a new energy balance steady state. And we have to also realize that low energy availability may be unintentional. So perhaps someone's suddenly doing an awful lot of training and they're not eating adequately for the amount of activity they're doing. It could be also due to eating disorders or disordered eating. So, but we have to understand it could be unintentional. For example, it could be a female runner who's getting into doing those distance things. You know, they might have a bit of a blunted appetite, which often happens with runners. So they're not getting enough energy in, and that can have effects on perhaps they stop their menstrual cycle. And perhaps they may be not having enough dietary iron, so they might start getting anemic. Those are just two examples. So, like I said, it can be unintentional. It could be due to perhaps some kind of eating disorder or disordered eating. So let's go to the next slide. So what are the outcomes? So obviously, there can be some quite serious outcomes if we're at the clinical level of low energy availability. And in 2014, the IOS, the International Olympic Committee, published a consensus statement entitled Beyond the Female Athlete Triad, and they called it Relative Energy Deficiency in Sport, which is abbreviated to REDS. So when you see REDS, that's actually what it means. And it describes 10 health outcomes and 10 potential performance effects resulting from low energy availability in athletes. And the reason that this terminology came about was it's to more accurately describe a clinical syndrome, originally known as the female athlete triad, which was 3 interrelated components, which involved energy availability, menstrual function, and bone health. But a lot of studies since that time realised that there's actually more to it there. And obviously, the female athlete triad is only referring to female athletes, where we do know that it affects male athletes as well. Although it is suggested to be a higher incidence in females, but it can affect men as well, particularly endurance runners. So the REDS has a few different things that can be happening, as you can see. If you see the triad, the original female athlete triad is there, you can see those 3 aspects, the low energy, the menstrual function, and bone health, but you can see there's a lot more going on in REDS. So it's acknowledged now that it can have impacts on all sorts of health. So, gastrointestinal, cardiovascular, in adolescent athletes, growth and development. It could be immune function, as well as endocrine function and metabolic. So there's lots of things that we're having. So all this can lead to potential performance effects, which could be increased injury risk, perhaps a decrease in training response, decreased endurance performance, concentration, depression, decreased glycogen stores, muscle strength can be decreased as well. So you can see that it can have a lot of possible impacts. Now, when it comes to actually screening for this, it's actually quite difficult, but there is a REDS clinical assessment tool, which is for use by medical professionals. And also there are various other diagnostic criteria, perhaps if an athlete has eating disorder. There's also questionnaires, a drive for thinness score, but there is a lot of stigma attached still to this day with somebody having an eating disorder. So athletes may try and hide the fact that they do have this kind of issue. And it's also reported that energy deficiency is actually can be really high in some athletes without the presence of an eating disorder. So the current evidence suggests that eating disorders in adult endurance athletes can be between 9 to 24%, but it's thought that low energy availability can be anywhere between 18 to 58% in sub-elite and elite middle distance athletes. So you can see that low energy availability can be there without a diagnosed eating disorder. So what about prevention? Obviously, one of the things can be improved awareness, but not just from us as coaches, but athletes as well. So education in the importance of eating well is important. And also, I guess, laying the long-term health outcomes of poor nutrition. So if the energy availability is so low that it, has stopped menstrual function, you're looking at potential issues with bone density, which can be increased risk of stress fractures as well. So what about the treatment? Well, obviously, if it's unintentional, then nutrition education may suffice. And that may be, talking about the quantity and timing of food intake around sport, as well as the overall quantity. So making sure there's enough calories around for the amount of activity done and the daily bodily functions that are required. Looking at food choices, so that could be perhaps someone who's anemic, making sure they get iron-rich foods. So it could be as simple as nutrition education. And you have to remember that, a runner may be perhaps wanting to lose a bit of weight, and perhaps they have and they're feeling good and they're running well, but, some warning signs would be if a female perhaps had a loss of menstrual function. If somebody did have stress fracture, is that indicative of just overtraining, or is it perhaps something to do with bone density? So perhaps a DEXA scan, that could assess the bone density might be warranted. Feeling really tired, they might have a blood test at doctors and find out they're low in iron. So they may be doing well in running, and they may be new to running, so they may be improving, but potential could be that they could improve even more if the body was, working as well as it should do. So if it's a eating disorder or a disordered eating that's identified, then a multidisciplinary team approach is involved, which can involve dietitians, sports doctors, GPs, psychologists or psychiatrists, and even coaches. If it's an elite level athlete, that can involve the coach as well, especially if it's a team environment. So what is the coach's role? Well, I think that, we all need to be aware that there is such a thing as low energy availability, and we need to be aware of RED-S and its consequences, particularly long-term health. But even in the short term, if calories get really, really low, that for even a short period of time, that can, actually have consequences for metabolism and lots of other functions in the body. So we have to be aware that there are consequences. So have friendly, casual discussions with your training group. Maybe have chats about, has anyone heard of RED-S or low energy availability? How's everyone going with their training and everything? And if a runner talks a lot about fatigue or perhaps loss of performance, or they're prone to injuries, or having they have issues with energy levels, you can refer them to come and see me. But perhaps suggest, when did you last go to the GP? Have you had blood tests recently? Have you ever been, happen to know if you've ever been low in iron? You have all these conversations. I think the other thing we really need to do as coaches is lead by example. Because as in-training coaches, we're pretty unique in as much as we are all runners. So I think that if your training group see that you eat well and that you have rest days and that you don't overtrain and you train strategically, I think that's really important. I must say, as a sports dietitian and a dietitian, I find that people watch quite closely what I eat, which I guess is not surprising. But I make sure that I do, eat well, and I allow myself treats, but I do have rest days, and I, don't overtrain. You can talk about energy availability in as much as saying, we're doing a long run today. Oh, what did you have for dinner last night? You may say, I had some rice or something, or what's your go-to pre-run food? Because that's talking about the energy availability for to do that run. The energy availability during long runs, are you trying goo chews or gels or jelly beans or snakes, sports drink? How do you go with Endura? That kind of thing. Talk about it. But I do think if you have any concerns, you should discuss it with senior coaching staff. Okay, training and food. Once again, talk to your athletes. It's important that you keep enforcing the fact that smart eating goes hand in hand with smart training. We have to understand how important what we eat is for health and sport. Yes, we can get by not eating so well, and it still provides us with energy, but you've got to think of the importance of eating well, getting plenty of fresh, minimally processed food like fruits and vegetables, but making sure you have those quality carbohydrates around your sport, whether it's pasta, bread, rice, fruit, that kind of thing, that we do eat well. Talking about, starting well fuel can help you get the most out of sessions. So, for example, high intensity sessions, or perhaps, you've finished work and you're doing a Thursday threshold session, talk to people, do you have a snack in the afternoon? Talk about what you do. People obviously often ask me, and I'll explain that, what I might do. Refueling appropriately can help with training adaptation, so making sure that people are aware of that. So sometimes with maybe your group, you might go out for breakfast after a long run, and you're picking a mixture, hopefully, of carbohydrate and protein foods. And that's where the magic happens on those after the training. If you get the appropriate nutrition in, that's when all the training adaptations can help, building a bit more lean muscle mass, perhaps some protein if there's any slight muscle repair required, getting the carbohydrate in to refuel the muscles. And also that good nutrition is really important for injury prevention and treatment. So obviously if, there's more to bone health than just calcium intake, but obviously that's an important factor. But we need adequate energy availability for all physiological function. So if perhaps we're constantly, getting low energy availability, you might still be able to run, but is that person constantly getting injured? Can they reduce their risk by eating better, making sure they get enough calcium for their bones? But also the role of nutrition in treatment. So if someone's injured, we don't want them to then be cutting back so much because they're concerned about gaining weight that they're not getting the adequate nutrition for repair, and so that might be making sure they have adequate protein intake spread over the day. Yes, it might be appropriate for somebody to cut back a little bit on carbohydrate, but they still need to eat well. And there's also some really good studies and research in the area of consuming gelatin products for tendon and ligament repair. So if someone's had like a ACL done, there's specific exercises that can be done, strengthening, and the timing of consuming gelatin then for collagen synthesis is having some really good results. I think there's some good work being done with football players in that. So, there's a lot of exciting things happening in the world of nutrition, and it is really important throughout our life, but important for sport, but also injury prevention and injury treatment. So how do we manage the obsessive runner? I think we need to constantly reinforce why we train the way we do, why the session is done in a certain way. I know I have one runner in my group, and I have to make sure that they don't go flat out all the time, because some people, particularly I find with new runners, when they're new, they seem to think that they need to be going as hard as they can all the time. So explain why we do what we do, why the marathon school has a certain number of rest days in it, and why, your speed work is for your speed work day, your long run should be done at a lower rate, why we should have rest days, why we shouldn't always be racing park run. Emphasising the importance of listening to your body. I think that's really a good one, something I've got better at since I've become older. So if you have a niggle, if that doesn't go away, it's suggesting that needs to be addressed. If someone's really fatigued, perhaps should you really be flogging out that extra 2K on your long run if you've got nothing left, stressing the importance of rest, eating well. I like the concept of the car analogy, having fuel in the tank. I think that's important. And I think you should flag any concerns with other coaches. If you know a runner is attending more than one training group, and perhaps you having, perhaps concerns about the way they approach their training, or Or, you know, a lot of us are on Strava or Garmin Connect, and you might be able to see what they're doing in pace. And I've had that discussion with people in my group that, you know, what's your long run pace? And I say it's too fast. And, you know, explain to them why it's too fast. And I also think you should discuss concerns with senior coaching staff again. I recently had to discuss an obsessive runner with Margot. It wasn't to do with eating so much as the way they were constantly pushing their body. And I thought, no, I've got to have this discussion with Margot. And it really helped to talk it through. And we've come up with a plan of how I'm going to deal with it. Interestingly enough, that person is actually themselves decided to take a couple of weeks off from the Monday night group, which is great. So they are finally listening to their body. But I find I constantly have to reinforce that with this particular person. So yeah, discuss things with senior coaching staff. So the next thing we're going to talk about is older runners and bone and mineral density. So unfortunately, you know, things happen as we age, and hormonal changes impact our bone mineral density. In females, of course, it's to do with the reduced estrogen post-menopause. But in males, there's also a decline in the testosterone hormone, but at a much slower rate. But by age 65, it's thought that we're both losing bone at roughly the same rate. And so, although bone health obviously is impacted by genes and lifestyle, and so we can't obviously change our genes, we can make sure we adopt a bone-friendly lifestyle. And although we're talking about older runners, I think we can do that throughout our life. We need to think about what is a bone-friendly lifestyle. And also, if you do know that perhaps there's a family history of osteoporosis, then, you know, it may be worth making doubly sure you have a bone-friendly lifestyle, but perhaps might be appropriate to get a DEXA scan as you get older, particularly if you've had some kind of bone fracture. So a bone-friendly lifestyle, that includes, amongst other things, there are other nutrients which are important, but obviously we need adequate calcium. Vitamin D is important, and also exercise, which hopefully, you know, we've partly ticked the box for that as runners. So bone-friendly lifestyle, the adequate dietary calcium. There's some good fact sheets on osteoporosis.org.au, and I've put the link here in case you would like to look at it, because there's a good list of sources of calcium on there which you might be interested in. And it also explains the increase in requirement as we get older. So for women over 50, the increase in calcium goes from 1,000 to 1,300 milligrams a day. And then for men, once they get to over 70 years, there's also that increase. Because of that, it's that slow decline in testosterone, but it does happen. So there's a higher requirement for calcium. Obviously, if somebody does choose to have cow milk and dairy in their life, then I think that that's a fantastic source of calcium. And as you can see, reduced fat calcium fortified milk is obviously much higher in calcium than regular milk. But I wanted to show you here that also there's a little bit more calcium in skim milk than regular, simply because the only thing that's removed from regular milk is the fat. So there's a little bit more calcium in the volume of skim milk. And this is what we'd call, a cup of milk is what you'd call a serve of dairy, or it could be a tub of yogurt or a couple of slices of cheese. There are also other sources of calcium. So if someone doesn't have dairy, there is soy milk, rice milk. Most of them are calcium fortified, but it's important to check that they are, to make sure that you're getting enough calcium. Other sources are things like canned fish, particularly sardines and water. You can see that's quite high for a little can because of the soft bones, which you hopefully consume with the sardines. And so obviously canned salmon with bones is going to be high for the same reason. But there are other sources. That's why I put the link up there for you. Things like soy, beans. So any like calcium set tofu, firm tofus are usually quite high in calcium, but there's a whole list of sources of calcium on that attachment, which you might find quite useful. So one of the things I personally have done since I've gone into my 50s, and now I'm 56 now, is I make a real concerted effort to make sure that I have that extra glass of milk, because I like milk, and so I might have that at night. So for me, that's a double whammy, because I'm going to get the calcium, but also I'm going to get some protein before I go to bed. And that brings me nicely on to protein, which I'll talk about just after the next bone-friendly thing. So adequate vitamin D is also another thing that's really important, because we need that to help us absorb the calcium. And there's quite a lot of Australians who are actually low in vitamin D. So the best way to get it is there's not many foods that contain vitamin D. It's really limited. There is some vitamin D in oily fish and in liver and in egg yolks, and there are some fortified food products. But the best way is via safe sun exposure. So obviously in Queensland, the safe sun exposure is going to be when the UV rays aren't too intense. So I've put another link there for you. There's a really good fact sheet on safe sun exposure. And yes, you can still absorb vitamin D when you're using sunblock, because even the factor 50 sunblocks is only going to block out I think it's about 98% of the UV rays, so there's a little bit that's going to get through. But it can be the vitamin D sun exposure can be as simple as a few minutes on the hands and arms, early in the morning or late at night. It could be like, from walking from your car to a shop or something, you're getting out a bit of vitamin D. So I'd still need to put that sunblock on when you're out running in the heat. The other thing is adequate exercise. So as runners, obviously, hopefully we've got good weight bearing on our legs, on the bones in our legs, but we've also got to think about perhaps resistance training. So there's another fact sheet there, which is good. So progressive resistance training is good for bones, because it's putting that strain. So once a certain amount of, say, lifting a little bit of free weights, say, becomes easy, you want to then try and increase that slightly so that you're putting that extra load on the bones. And that's something that I'm really going to look at. So I've got good bone density, I know, because I've had a DEXA scan, which is good to know. But I want to make sure that I'm not just thinking about weight bearing with my legs. And so I want to think about my other bones. So resistance training, just doing a bit of weights with my arms at home would be a good thing to do. And that's another important thing with the bone health. That brings me on to, I thought I'd talk about muscle mass as well, because this is something that's really important. And there is a fact sheet on masters runners. There's a paper on the Coaches Education newsletter that you got through that I mentioned at the beginning. So unfortunately, another thing that happens with aging is this loss of muscle mass and strength and function, which can start in our 4th to 5th decade, so in our 40s and 50s. And it does accelerate after age 70 to 75. But the good news is that regular exercise and adequate dietary protein intake can work to offset the effects of age-related muscle loss. So I think the advantage of perhaps being a masters athlete and you're already doing exercise is you're a good starting point, hopefully. If you make sure you get adequate dietary protein, then perhaps someone who is aging and doesn't do any exercise. So the way to do this is to try and consume high quality proteins, and the high quality ones are the things like dairy, eggs, meat, fish, that kind of thing. But even if you're consuming plant proteins, making sure you get a big variety of plant proteins so that you're getting all the amino acids that you need for health. The other thing is spreading your intake over the day. Now this is important as runners, even if we're not the masters athlete, but particularly as we get older, you need to make sure you're getting that protein in after, particularly after your long runs. The window of opportunity, is important, particularly as we get older. And we also need to make sure we probably get a little bit more protein as well. Now, for most Australians, our total protein intake is usually fine during the day, but we're not good at spreading it out. And it's thought that older endurance athletes need, up to 1.6 to 1.8 grams per kilo a day, whereas the dietary guidelines are saying for someone who's not a masters athlete, 0.8 to 1 gram per kilo is adequate. So you can see it is a bit higher, and it's also suggested that postmenopausal women require a similar amount to male athletes. So if we look at a really, like a tiny female, say 50 to 55 kilos, you're looking at about 80 to 100 grams of protein a day, which isn't a huge amount if you think that 100 grams of cooked chicken breast is 30 grams of protein. But the main thing is you've got to spread it out. So that's, and 200 grams of 250 ml of milk, for example, provides about 9 grams of protein. So like I said, I make a point of having another serve of dairy before bed now for the calcium, but also because there's a little bit of protein in there. But I make sure that post runs, particularly harder runs, maybe long runs or speed work session, I do get that protein in when I finish, because it's just really important. So, whilst it's important to continue to eat well as we age, we do have to pay attention to making sure we get adequate exercise and adequate dietary protein. Okay, so that's pretty much it from me. Quite a lot of information to take in there, but it's I think the main thing is because you have this sort of close relationship, hopefully, with your training groups, that you can have a bit of a chat about food and nutrition. And I know that some of you do socialise. I know I do with my group. We go out to meals and things, and leading by example, not always racing, park run. I purposely sometimes sit behind one of my group, and I tell them before I start that I'm not racing it, so they realise you don't always have to go flat out. Leading by example with eating well and everything, if possible. I think that's another good thing we can do. Anyway, if you have any questions, as Margot said yesterday, you can post them on the coaches page, and I will be able to see them as I am one of the coaches. All right, thank you.